At 2 in the afternoon, the air outside the CEO's office on the top floor of Sterling Corporation headquarters was thick with tension. Victoria Sterling's new executive assistant, Sarah, stood holding a cup of coffee, her palms sweating. Pacing outside Victoria's office for the third time, Sarah flinched when an impatient snarl came from within, so close it nearly made her spill the coffee. She took a deep breath, pushed open the heavy, solid wood door, and walked in cautiously. Inside, Victoria Sterling, just back from a month-long honeymoon in Europe, was leaning back in a pricey Herman Miller executive chair. Her long legs were crossed, and her custom-tailored suit was immaculate. She was on the phone, one hand holding it to her ear, but her beautiful brow was furrowed in frustration. "Ethan, you just stay home and get over your jet lag. It's a total mess here at the office, and it's driving me insane." Her voice, meant for the phone, was uncharacteristically gentle. But the second she hung up, her expression turned to stone. She looked up at Sarah, her gaze as sharp as ice. "Miss Sterling, your coffee." Sarah quickly placed the cup on the desk. Victoria picked it up, took a sip, and her frown deepened. She slammed the cup back down on the desk, splashing a few drops of coffee onto the polished surface. "It's 3 degrees too hot, and you used 1 part too much sugar," she said, her voice cold and devoid of any warmth. "This is the executive assistant HR found for me? Can't even make a decent cup of coffee." Sarah's face went pale. She bowed repeatedly. "I'm so sorry, Miss Sterling. I'll be more careful next time." "Next time?" Victoria scoffed, her condescending glare making it hard for Sarah to breathe. "Where is my schedule? Are the flights and hotel for Zurich booked for next week? And notify all department heads that there's a meeting in 30 minutes. I want the semi-annual financial reports and the strategic plan for the second half of the year ready to go." The rapid-fire commands left Sarah completely flustered. She fumbled with her tablet. "Miss Sterling, the schedule, I'm still confirming it. And I couldn't find the preference list for your flights and hotels. A meeting in 30 minutes. Isn't that too sudden? The departmental reports haven't been compiled yet." "Enough!" Victoria slammed her hand on the desk and shot to her feet. She tugged at the silk scarf at her neck in irritation and paced around the office. Everything was a mess. From the moment she'd stepped into the company, nothing had gone smoothly. A chaotic schedule, missing files, and a clueless new assistant. A knot of frustration tightened in her chest. She stopped abruptly, staring at Sarah, and finally voiced the source of her anger. She picked up the internal phone and dialed. Her tone was venomous. "Human resources? I don't care what you have to do. Get me Daniel Kane back here now. Tell him his vacation is over. If he doesn't haul himself into my office in the next 10 minutes, he can forget about ever stepping foot in Sterling Corporation again." The HR manager on the other end was terrified. Standing beside the desk, Sarah looked paler than a ghost. Her voice trembled as she spoke. Miss Sterling." Victoria slammed the phone down, her icy gaze sweeping over her. "What are you still standing here for? Are you waiting for me to buy you dinner?" "No, that's not it." Mustering all her courage, Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Miss Sterling, Mr. Kane, he came in this morning to file his resignation." Victoria froze. She turned around slowly, a look of disbelief on her face, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "What did you say?" "Mr. Kane resigned," Sarah repeated, a little louder this time. He said he's going back to his hometown to get married, so he won't be coming back." A dead silence fell over the office. Victoria stared at Sarah for a full 10 seconds. The shock on her beautiful face slowly faded, replaced by a look of absurd, contemptuous amusement. "Ha!" she laughed, as if she just heard the funniest joke of the year. She sat back down in her chair, leaned back, and pulled out her phone to call Ethan, her voice dripping with undisguised mockery. "Did you hear that, Ethan? My dear assistant is trying a new tactic to force my hand." Ethan's gentle voice came through the phone. "Victoria, don't be angry. He's been with you for so many years. It's normal for him to act out. But doesn't he know we just got married in Europe?" "Of course he knows. The whole world knows," Victoria said with a light laugh, her eyes scanning the bustling financial district outside her window. Her tone was confident and cruel. That's why this is called desperation. He'll be back in 3 days, begging for his job. She hung up and tossed the phone casually onto the desk, the scorn in her eyes deepening. A man with no connections, who had only climbed to the executive assistant position through sheer competence. What kind of future could he possibly have without her, without the fortress that was Sterling Corporation? Marriage was just another clumsy ploy, another attempt at playing hard to get. Victoria could almost picture Daniel holed up in some corner right now, anxiously waiting for her call. The smile on her lips grew colder. She wouldn't call. She would wait for him to realize his little drama had failed, and then, just like countless times before, he would come back to her, head bowed, with the perfect amount of apology in his eyes. But this time, Victoria didn't know. She would be waiting forever. On the first day of Daniel's absence, the finely tuned machine of Sterling Corporation began to show the first signs of falling apart. The afternoon meeting was a disaster, derailed by Victoria's temper. The finance department's report had contradictory data. The marketing department's presentation was riddled with errors, and even the conference room projector malfunctioned. You can't even handle these simple things? What exactly do I pay you for? Victoria slammed a stack of files onto the table. The dozen or so department heads in attendance were dead silent. After the meeting, she returned to her office, her face a thundercloud, only to find the new assistant, Sarah, standing at the door, drowning in a sea of paperwork. Ms. Sterling, this is the itinerary for your private dinner next week with Ms. Hoffman from UBS. Please take a look. Victoria took it and glanced over it, her brow immediately knitting into a tight knot. The venue is the Blue Bay Club? Did I authorize that? She demanded. Sarah looked clueless. Miss Sterling, the Blue Bay Club is the most exclusive private club in the city. I saw from previous records. Ms. Hoffman is allergic to seafood, and the Blue Bay Club's chef specializes in seafood. Victoria cut her off, her voice frigid. Also, her husband prefers Serge Luton's Fee and Aiguilles, not this generic Joe Malone. Didn't you even look at the most basic client profiles? Sarah was on the verge of tears. Ms. Sterling, all the previous client files were managed by Mr. Kane. His computer access has been locked. We couldn't find them. If you can't find them, figure it out. Victoria crumpled the itinerary into a ball and threw it on the floor. I don't care what you have to do. Get this all sorted out by tonight. Otherwise, your entire assistant team is fired. Sarah scrambled out of the room, tears streaming down her face. In the office, Victoria irritably pulled off her scarf and slammed her fist on the desk. This wasn't the first time. Since the morning, she felt like a warrior who had lost both her right and left hands, hamstrung at every turn. She instinctively started to call for Daniel, only to remember in the middle of saying his name that the man was gone. She opened her personal email, hoping to find old files, but it was wiped clean. All the detailed client notes, travel plans, and even her personal reminders were gone. Those were things Daniel had synced to her daily from his personal account. Now that he was gone, that account was silent. It was only then that she began to realize that over the past 7 years, Daniel had seeped into every corner of her work and life like air. He wasn't just an assistant, he was a super data processing center, freeing her from all the tedious, mundane tasks so she could focus on the most important strategic decisions. And she had taken it all for granted, even looking down on it. It's just an assistant's job, what's the big deal? Victoria told herself, trying to suppress the unfamiliar panic rising in her chest. She picked up the phone again, this time calling the director of public relations. Hello, it's me. Her voice had regained its usual composure. Contact Ms. Hoffman's secretary and reschedule the dinner details. Prepare a generous gift and say it's a small token of my apologies. She believed that with Sterling's financial power and status, they could easily make up for these minor oversights. However, half an hour later, the PR director called back, his voice tinged with unconcealed alarm. Ms. Sterling, we have a problem. Speak. Ms. Hoffman's office just replied. They said her schedule for next week has changed, and the dinner is canceled. Victoria's pupils contracted. Canceled? What was the reason? They didn't give a reason. The PR director's voice was trembling. The secretary's tone was very cold. She just said Ms. Hoffman was very disappointed with our arrangements. After the call ended, the office was deathly quiet. Victoria stood before the massive floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city lights begin to glitter outside, her expression so dark it looked like it could drip ink. UBS was the most critical link in her plan to break into the European market, and it had taken her a full year to get a connection with Hoffman. Now, all of that was gone, vanished because of one bungled dinner. For the first time, she was paying a heavy price for a man's departure. Daniel Kane. She whispered his name, a complex mix of emotions flashing in her eyes. Anger, frustration, and a sliver of regret she refused to acknowledge. She picked up her phone, pulled up his familiar number, hesitated for a moment, but ultimately didn't press dial. No, she couldn't back down. Victoria Sterling would never bow to a man who was trying to blackmail her with his resignation. She refused to believe that without Daniel Kane, her Sterling Corporation would actually fall apart. Late into the night, the lights in the CEO's office on the top floor of Sterling Corporation were still blazing. Victoria sat alone behind her desk, facing a mountain of files. The new assistant team had scrambled all day, but the work they submitted was still a complete mess. She had to review and revise every single document herself. At 2 a.m, she leaned back in her chair, exhausted, and rubbed her throbbing temples. In the quiet office, the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioner. The silence made her feel a loneliness she had never experienced before. For the past 7 years, no matter how late she worked, a warm lamp would always be lit at that man's desk. He would appear at the exact moment she needed him, with a cup of perfectly heated tea or a neatly organized data report. On a whim, Victoria stood up, walked out of her office, and into the assistant area outside. Daniel's workstation had been cleared out, leaving only standard-issue office supplies. She pulled open a drawer. It was empty. Just as she was about to close it, her fingers brushed against a thin notebook tucked away in the very back. She took it out and opened it. Familiar, handsome handwriting filled the pages. It was a dense log of notes all about her. Miss Sterling requires a black coffee before the morning meeting. No sugar, water at 87 degrees Celsius. She has a mild stomach condition. Lunch cannot be spicy, and antacids should be prepared before any business dinners. Remind her to eat on time and avoid cold foods. She is allergic to pollen. No fresh flowers are allowed in the office. November 7th is the anniversary of her mother's death. Schedule no meetings on that day. Her favorite brooch brand is Tom Ford. She prefers blue-toned silk scarves but dislikes paisley patterns. Page after page, from work habits to personal preferences, from professional relationships to private taboos, the details were exhaustive. It was a veritable Victoria Sterling encyclopedia. Victoria's fingers traced the handwriting, and her heart felt as if it were being squeezed by an invisible hand, a sharp, unfamiliar pain piercing through. She had never known that the quiet man who always kept his head down had observed her in such minute detail. He knew her better than she knew herself. For 7 years, he had been like the most sophisticated radar, scanning and recording everything about her, then silently clearing all the trivial obstacles from her path. And what had she given him in return? Entitled demands, the status of a secret lover, endless indifference, and a wedding announced to the entire world, a world from which he was the only one excluded. A powerful wave of frustration and regret washed over her. Victoria slammed the notebook shut, threw it back in the drawer with a dull thud, and told herself she couldn't think about it anymore. This had to be another one of Daniel's tricks, something he left behind intentionally to win her sympathy and make her regret her choices. Victoria Sterling would not fall for it. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Hong Kong, at a mansion in the mid-levels, Daniel Kane was lounging by a massive outdoor pool. Dressed in a comfortable silk robe, he calmly crossed a few names off a guest list on his tablet. Beside him, an elegant woman was personally cutting a plate of fruit for him. Her movements were graceful, her focus intense, as if she were handling a priceless work of art, not a fruit knife. "Isabella, you can take Victoria Sterling's name off the list," Daniel said quietly, his voice carried by the evening breeze. Isabella paused, looking up at him with a gentle, searching gaze. Still care? It's not that. Daniel shook his head, a faint, almost cold smile touching his lips. I just don't see the point anymore. He looked up at the glittering skyline of Victoria Harbor. The last 7 years were like a long internship. Now that the internship is over and I have the experience I wanted, it's time to make a clean break from my old boss. Isabella put down the fruit knife, walked over, and wrapped her arms around him, resting her head against his chest. That internship must have been hard on you, she said softly. Daniel didn't speak, just wrapped his arms around her in return. Not at all, he said after a long moment. At the very least, it taught me one thing. You can never wake someone who's pretending to be asleep, and you should never base your own value on someone else's approval. He turned to look at Isabella, his eyes clearer and more determined than ever. My value was never hers to define. Isabella saw the stars in his eyes and smiled. She leaned in and kissed his cheek. You're right, she said. But since the internship is over, shouldn't we show that former boss what a phenomenal resume she missed out on? Daniel smiled back, a glint of mischief in his eyes as he met her gaze. Perhaps, he said, but that depends on whether she even qualifies for an interview. Their figures embraced in the enchanting night. A new chapter for Daniel Kane was slowly beginning. And in a distant city, the woman he called his former boss was still agonizing over a lost file, oblivious to the fact that she was about to lose her entire world. Victoria Sterling's nightmare was far from over. The failure of the Hoffman dinner was like the first domino to fall, setting off a chain reaction. Several potential European investors who had been on the fence immediately became non-committal. But the real blow, the one that hit closest to home, was the ticking time bomb within the company Project Skyhawk. Project Skyhawk was an overseas acquisition of a high-tech company that Sterling Corp had initiated last year. It was the most critical part of their 5-year strategic plan. But now, in the company's highest-level board meeting, the project was shrouded in doubt. Victoria, are you sure there are no issues with the core data model for Project Skyhawk? The first to challenge her was a company veteran, her second uncle, Walter. Victoria's expression remained unchanged. Uncle Walter, this model has undergone hundreds of stress tests. It's absolutely foolproof. Foolproof? Walter sneered, tossing a file onto the conference table. Then explain why Wall Street's top venture capital firm, Obsidian Capital, suddenly withdrew their offer to lead our series of funding yesterday. The reason they gave was that the model has a fatal logical flaw. What? Victoria's face changed. She immediately picked up the file. Obsidian Capital's opinion was a bellwether for all of Wall Street. Their withdrawal was practically a death sentence for Project Skyhawk. The head of the tech department stood up, sweating profusely, his voice trembling. Ms. Sterling, directors, the model, it was built entirely by Assistant Kane. It contains a lot of proprietary source code and encryption algorithms that only he can decipher. Since he left, we've tried everything, but we can't access the core layer for maintenance, let alone fix any flaws. A mere assistant can determine the fate of our company's multi-billion-dollar project? Walter's tone was full of disbelief, his gaze like daggers aimed at Victoria. Victoria, don't you think you owe the board an explanation? How exactly do you manage your core team? In the boardroom, all eyes were on Victoria, questioning, scrutinizing, and some even gloating. Her face turned pale, and her hands, hidden under the table, were clenched into tight fists. She never imagined that Daniel would dare to leave such a massive landmine for her before he left. He hadn't just taken his talent with him, he'd left behind a time bomb she had no way of defusing. She took a deep breath, forcing down her shock and anger. She looked up, met their gazes, and kept her voice steady. Everyone, rest assured, I will handle this. She turned to the tech director, her tone leaving no room for argument. It's just an assistant's work. It's not a big deal. I'm giving you 3 days. I don't care what it takes. Even if you have to hire the best programmers in the world, you will crack this model for me. She sounded tough, but for the first time, a sense of powerlessness washed over her. She knew this wasn't about money. The model Daniel had built integrated cutting-edge financial algorithms with his own unique encryption methods. It was his core technology. It was less a piece of company property and more the embodiment of his personal genius. After the meeting, Victoria returned to her office and immediately had her assistant team frantically contact the world's top data engineers. However, the response was always the same: impossible to crack or requires personal authorization from the creator. She threw her phone onto the sofa in frustration, feeling a true sense of panic for the first time. Her proud business empire seemed to be developing cracks at its very foundation, all because of one man's departure. She thought of his number again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She had to get Daniel back, at least until Project Skyhawk was complete. She needed him. She picked up her phone, took a deep breath, and dialed the number she knew by heart. But the voice on the other end was a cold, robotic recording. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. No longer in service? Victoria was stunned. She double-checked the number. It was correct. He had actually changed his number. An unprecedented wave of fury, mixed with a fear she wouldn't admit even to herself, shot through her. This man was truly trying to cut all ties with her. She screamed at the door. "Sarah?" Sarah came stumbling in. "Miss Sterling, how can I help?" "Find him. I want you to find out where Daniel Kane is right now. Use every resource you have. I don't care if you have to tear this city apart. You find him for me." Victoria's voice was distorted with rage. Yes. One day passed, then two. Victoria used all her contacts and resources, but came up with nothing. It was as if Daniel Kane had vanished from the face of the earth. There were no flight or train records, no hotel check-ins. His entire file seemed to be protected by an invisible wall, and for the first time, her vaunted network had hit a dead end. Just as Victoria was about to lose her patience, Sarah finally knocked on her office door, holding a file. "Miss Sterling, we found something." Victoria snatched the file. On it was a single line of text: Target, Daniel Kane. Last known location, the Linwood Estate. No.
1 Ripon Bay, Hong Kong.
Hong Kong, the Linwood family? Victoria's pupils shrank. Of course she knew what the Linwood family of Hong Kong represented. They were a true legacy family, a dynasty that even her family had to look up to. How could Daniel possibly be connected to them? A ridiculous thought flashed through her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. Impossible. There must be a mistake. Maybe he was just working there as a tutor or a gardener. She stared at the address, her eyes filled with shock and doubt. She had a sinking feeling that things were spiraling far beyond her control. A massive iceberg, of which she had never seen the full picture, was slowly revealing its terrifying, minuscule tip. While Victoria was being tormented by Project Skyhawk and Daniel's mysterious disappearance, another, bigger storm was brewing. In a Sterling Corporation conference room, the atmosphere was so oppressive it was almost hard to breathe. The entire core team for the Smart City project was seated around the table, their faces etched with exhaustion and anxiety. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her expression grim. Half an hour earlier, they had received a second and final warning from their client, the mysterious overseas conglomerate known as the Genesis Consortium. A harshly worded email was projected onto the large screen. "We have received your second revised proposal. Frankly, the result is extremely disappointing. Not only does the proposal fail to address any of the core issues we raised last time, but it also introduces more unrealistic fantasies. The data support is weak, the risk model is non-existent, and the business logic is chaotic." Every word of the email was like a sharp slap across the face of Victoria and her entire team. The project director's voice trembled as he spoke. "Ms. Sterling, Genesis is being very firm. They said if we can't produce a satisfactory proposal at the final bid meeting in 1 week, they will not only terminate the partnership but will also place Sterling Corp on their permanent blacklist and notify the entire industry of our unprofessionalism." His words hit the room like a bombshell.
Permanent blacklist?
And notify the whole industry. That's too harsh. This isn't just about losing a deal anymore. This could destroy Sterling's reputation. Who are these Genesis people anyway? Why are they so ruthless? Listening to the chatter, Victoria's face grew darker. The Smart City project was her baby. She had personally guaranteed the board that it would be the landmark project for Sterling's next phase of growth. If this project failed, she would not only become a laughingstock in the industry but would also lose all credibility within the company. It was a failure she absolutely could not accept. "All of you, be quiet," she snapped, and the room fell silent. She stood up, her eyes sweeping over everyone present, her voice cold and decisive. "A crisis is also an opportunity. Times like these are a true test of our abilities. I am now announcing that effective immediately, all members of the project team will have their vacations canceled. Everyone will remain at the company on 24-hour standby. We must win the bid in 1 week. At any cost." She tried to rally their spirits, but it had little effect. Everyone knew the problem wasn't a lack of effort, but a fundamental flaw in their approach. After the meeting, the project director hesitated before knocking on Victoria's office door. "Ms. Sterling, there's something I feel I should mention." "Go on." "I've been carefully studying Genesis's reasons for rejecting our proposal, and I find their way of thinking, their whole critical perspective, it's very familiar." "Familiar?" Victoria frowned. "Yes," the project director nodded, choosing his words carefully. "It's very much like how Assistant Kane used to shoot down our internal proposals when he was still here. The same sharpness, the same way of getting straight to the point, the same absolute refusal to pull any punches." Victoria's heart sank. She opened the email again, reading it word by word. It was true. The calm, objective, yet authoritatively judgmental tone, the almost obsessive demand for data and logic, it was similar. Too similar. An even more absurd, more unbelievable idea began to form in her mind. "No, impossible. Daniel was just an assistant. How could he possibly be connected to a powerhouse like the Genesis Consortium? It had to be a coincidence." She shook her head forcefully, trying to banish the ridiculous thought. She spoke to the project director in a low voice. "Stop letting your imagination run wild. The most important thing right now is to find the problem with the proposal and fix it. You can go now." After the director left, Victoria sat alone in the vast office, her thoughts in turmoil. She picked up the report on Daniel's whereabouts again, her eyes fixed on the words "the Linwood estate." No. One repulse bay. The unknown was breeding fear. For the first time, she realized she knew nothing about the man who had been by her side for 7 years. And that ignorance was like an expanding black hole, beginning to swallow everything she had ever been proud of. The Smart City project had become a sword of Damocles hanging over her head. She knew that this time, she could not afford to lose. While Victoria was being driven to the brink by the Smart City project, in another world, the Linwood estate in Hong Kong, a high-level family meeting that would decide the flow of hundreds of billions of dollars was underway in a heavily secured conference room. Seated around the long table were the elders of the Linwood family, men who could shake the foundations of Asian finance with a single word. Today, they had gathered for one reason: to decide whether to make an additional strategic investment in the Smart City project led by the Genesis Consortium. The atmosphere was tense. A white-haired elder spoke in a deep voice. "Isabella, while this project has great potential, the risks are also extremely high, particularly their chosen partner on the mainland, Sterling Corporation. According to our assessment, their capabilities are questionable. I'm afraid they will drag down the entire project." Others murmured in agreement. Indeed, Sterling's young CEO, Victoria Sterling, may be clever, but she lacks vision and is not fit for a project of this scale. Is it really wise to risk another $30 billion for a partner like that? Seated at the head of the table, Isabella's expression was unreadable. She didn't rush to argue. Instead, she turned her gaze to the man sitting beside her, who had been silent since the meeting began, Daniel Kane. "Daniel, what do you think?" Her voice was gentle, a stark contrast to the room's severe mood. In an instant, every elder's eyes were fixed on Daniel. They looked at him with curiosity, scrutiny, and a touch of condescension. They knew he was the mysterious man Isabella had chosen as her fiancé. But this was a core Linwood family decision-making meeting. Allowing an outsider, and such a young one at that, To voice his opinion was somewhat against protocol. Daniel met their gazes calmly. He showed no fear, simply tapping open the tablet in front of him and projecting the data onto the large screen. "Good evening, uncles." His voice was clear and pleasant, carrying a natural authority. "Regarding Sterling Corporation, your assessments are correct. They are indeed the most unstable element in this project." He paused, then shifted his tone. With a light tap on the screen, a complex stream of data began to flow. "However, the core of the Smart City project isn't about what Sterling can do, but what they can't do." He looked up, his eyes scanning each person in the room, his voice firm and clear. Sterling's role, from the very beginning, was never to be a partner, but a stress test. Their existence is to test the project's absolute limits when faced with an unprofessional, deeply flawed executor. Every mistake they make, every piece of garbage they submit, provides us with invaluable real-world data for our future risk mitigation. The room fell silent. The elders were stunned. They had never considered the problem from this angle. Daniel continued, "As for the additional investment, I support it. But this money isn't for the project itself, it's for our backup plan. The moment Sterling is eliminated in the final bid, we will immediately activate Plan B, and another technology firm, one we control, will take over seamlessly. By then, all the data from the initial tests will be a stepping stone to our success." When he finished, the room was utterly quiet. After a long moment, the elder who had first raised objections looked at Daniel with undisguised admiration and shock. He nodded slowly. "A stress test. And a Plan B. Impressive. Truly impressive." The other elders also looked at him with approval. Their gazes had transformed from scrutiny to genuine respect. This young man was not only strikingly handsome but possessed a strategic depth and ruthlessness that put even them old foxes of the business world to shame. The outcome of the meeting was no longer in doubt. Afterward, Isabella walked with Daniel down a long corridor in the estate. "I knew that once you spoke, they wouldn't have another word to say," she said with a smile, her eyes full of affection. "I just told the truth," Daniel replied, his tone still even, but a hint of warmth had crept onto his face. "So," Isabella stopped and turned to face him, a playful look in her eyes. "What if Sterling's proposal somehow passes?" Daniel looked down at her and smiled. It was a smile like a night blooming serious, cool and stunningly handsome. He said softly, "With me there, what chance does she have?" In that moment, Isabella saw in his eyes a light she could only describe as absolute control. She knew that the Daniel Kane who had endured 7 years by Victoria Sterling's side was gone forever. Standing before her now was the heir to the Kane family, a king about to take command of a $100 billion empire. And Victoria was nothing more than a trivial, soon-to-be crushed pebble on his path to coronation. The Linwood family meeting not only unanimously approved the additional investment in the Smart City project, but at Daniel's suggestion, they also granted him supreme decision-making authority over it, a power that superseded even Isabella's. This was unprecedented in the family's 100-year history. The fact that this yet-to-be-married fiancé could wield such immense power sent shockwaves through Hong Kong's elite circles. Everyone was speculating about the mysterious Mr. Kane's true identity. At that moment, the mysterious Mr. Kane was in Isabella's study, dressed in casual clothes, focused on assembling a highly complex Lego model. Isabella finished her work and came to sit beside him, handing him a piece. "You've completely stunned those old men on the board," she said with a smile. "The whole company is buzzing that you're our new secret weapon." "I'm not a weapon," Daniel said without looking up, snapping the piece perfectly into place. "I'm just a businessman, and businessmen don't make losing deals." "Oh?" Isabella raised an eyebrow. "Then tell me, what did you gain from this deal?" Daniel stopped and looked up at her, his expression serious. "I got back the 7 years I invested," he said, "and I gained the best business partner I could ask for." Isabella's heart warmed. She knew that coming from him, business partner was the highest form of praise. She reached out and gently stroked his hair. "In that case, is there anything your best partner can do for you? For instance, I could arrange for Sterling Corporation's capital flow to run into some minor issues. With the Linwood family's power, Putting a company like Sterling in jeopardy would be child's play. But Daniel shook his head. No, he said, that would be letting her off too easy. He stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing out at the deep night. His voice was calm but laced with a chilling resolve. I don't want her to go bankrupt, he said. I want her, at the peak of her pride, at the moment she believes she controls everything, to watch with her own eyes as everything she built turns to dust in front of me. He turned to face Isabella, a cool fire burning in his eyes. I want her to lose completely, to lose without a single excuse, and to lose everyone and everything she has. Looking at him, Isabella felt not that he was cruel, but a deep sense of admiration and sympathy. She knew how much pain he must have suppressed to say such words. She walked to him. All right, she said. One word, but it held a universe of promises. I'm not doing this for you, she said, looking into his eyes. I'm just clearing the stage for my husband's coronation. Daniel pulled Isabella into an embrace, feeling the steady, strong beat of her heart. The tension he had held for so long finally began to ease. He wasn't fighting alone. He had the entire Linwood family behind him, and he had Isabella's unconditional support. The next day, Isabella mobilized her resources. She didn't attack Sterling directly, she did something far more devastating. In her capacity as the Linwood family heiress, she sent out invitations to dozens of the world's top tech and financial media outlets, inviting them to the final bid and partner press conference for the Smart City project, hosted by the Genesis Consortium in 1 week. The invitation landed like a boulder in a calm lake, sending ripples everywhere. The Linwood heiress is personally attending? The Genesis Consortium must be a huge deal. It seems the Smart City project is a key part of the Linwood family's future strategy. Final bid. So Sterling Corporation isn't guaranteed to be the partner? The news spread like wildfire, and all eyes turned to the bidding event. Victoria, of course, got the news as well. Seeing Isabella's name tied so closely to the Smart City project made her sick to her stomach. She had thought this was a normal business competition. Now it was clear this was a show run by giants, and Sterling was just one of the desperate contestants. What unsettled her even more were the reports from her contacts in Hong Kong. They said Isabella Linwood was getting married soon, but no one knew the true identity of her mysterious fiancé. A sense of dread, like a creeping vine, wrapped itself around her heart. She had a gut feeling that the bidding event in 1 week would not just determine her business success or failure, it would be a judgment she could neither predict nor endure. Time crawled toward the final judgment day in an atmosphere of extreme pressure. Sterling Corporation had become a high-speed war machine. Victoria, in an almost obsessive state, led her team through sleepless nights, endlessly revising their proposal. She locked herself in her office, running simulations, rejecting ideas, trying to mimic Daniel's thought process to anticipate every sharp question Genesis might throw at them. But the more she tried to imitate him, the more she felt out of her depth. She was discovering that Daniel's seemingly wild strategic ideas were backed by a vast foundation of knowledge and data she couldn't even begin to comprehend. She could copy the form, but she could never capture the substance. Just as she was reaching her breaking point, an official email from the Genesis Consortium arrived in the inboxes of all bidding companies. It was a simple personnel announcement. To ensure the professionalism and authority of the final Smart City project proposal, the Genesis Board of Directors has appointed Mr. Daniel Kane as the Chief Technical Advisor for this bidding process. Mr. Kane will have single-vote veto power, and his final assessment will directly determine the outcome of the project. Attached to the email was Mr. Daniel Kane's resume. It was startlingly brief. Daniel Kane, Ph.D. in Computer Science, Artificial Intelligence, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Former lead architect on 3 world-class Smart City projects. The resume sent shockwaves through the Sterling project team. Mit Ph.D. and a leading expert on 3 global projects. My God, this client is terrifying. Single-vote veto power? Our fate is literally in this guy's hands. Daniel Kane, why does that name sound familiar? Victoria stared at the name Daniel Kane, her heart hammering against her ribs. Daniel Kane, Daniel Kane. No, impossible, she screamed internally. It has to be a coincidence. There are plenty of people with that name. The Daniel Kane I knew was just an ordinary assistant. How could he be an MIT PhD? How could he have led world-class projects? Absolutely not. She forcibly suppressed the absurd thought, but the unease grew like a weed in her mind. She gave her team a final order. Find him. I want every piece of information you can find on this Daniel Kane. I want to know everything about him. 1 day passed, then 2. The result was still a blank slate. This Daniel Kane was a ghost. Aside from that terrifyingly simple resume, there were no photos, no further information about him online. His past was shrouded in mist. The more mysterious he was, the more terrifying he became. Victoria began to feel as though an invisible net was closing in on her from all sides, and she was the helpless prey caught in the middle, oblivious to the danger. And Daniel, the man she had once despised, seemed to be standing just outside the net, watching her coldly, about to pull the final rope. The thought sent a chill down her spine. No, she couldn't scare herself. She told herself over and over that it was all a coincidence. Daniel's resignation, the Linwood engagement, the mysterious chief advisor, there was no way these things were connected. The only thing she could do now was pin all her hopes on the bid. She would conquer this so-called chief advisor with a perfect proposal and win this war. She would show everyone that even without Daniel Kane, Victoria Sterling could still succeed. Her fighting spirit ignited. She threw herself into her work with a manic energy, completely unaware that all her struggles, all her efforts, were, in Daniel's eyes, nothing more than a futile performance in a show whose ending was already written. In the Linwood family study, Daniel was calmly reviewing Sterling Corporation's latest proposal, a document hundreds of pages long. Isabella came in and handed him a glass of warm milk. Still reading? Daniel nodded without looking up. Know thy enemy. The outcome may be certain, but we still have to go through the motions. He flipped to the last page, a faint, almost pitying smile on his lips. She's trying very hard, he said softly, as if speaking of a stranger. A shame she was heading in the wrong direction from the very beginning. He closed the tablet, looked up at Isabella, and said, "Let's go. It's time to see our old friend." The night before the bid, Sterling Corporation headquarters was ablaze with light, an island of sleepless activity. Victoria stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her office, looking down at the glittering river of city lights below. She held a glass of red wine, but her eyes were sharp and sober, filled with the elation of a general on the eve of a decisive battle. After a week of almost no sleep, they had produced what she believed to be a perfect proposal. It overturned all their previous thinking and adopted an incredibly bold technical architecture. It was the gamble of her career. A knock came at the door. The project director entered, his face weary but ecstatic. "Miss Sterling, all the data has been double-checked one last time. It's foolproof, and we've rehearsed the presentation at least 50 times. There won't be any mistakes." Victoria turned and raised her glass to him. "Good work." "It was nothing, Miss Sterling," the director said excitedly. "I can say with confidence that this is the most technologically advanced and forward-thinking proposal Sterling has ever produced. Not even that PhD from MIT will be able to find a single flaw." The rest of the team murmured in agreement, their faces glowing with post-crisis optimism. "That's right, Miss Sterling, we've got this in the bag. I can't wait to see the looks on our competitors' faces tomorrow." Seeing their high morale, Victoria's own confidence soared. She even began to believe that without Daniel, she had been pushed to unlock a greater potential, leading her team to unprecedented heights. She raised her glass to them, her voice booming. "Well said. Tomorrow we won't just win, we'll win spectacularly. I'll show everyone that Victoria Sterling is the queen of this industry." She was already planning the lavish victory party, imagining how she would leverage this win into a silent humiliation for the man who had abandoned her. She wanted to make him regret what he had missed. Just then, her personal cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. Frowning, she stepped aside to answer. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end was unexpected. It was Ethan. "Victoria, it's me." Ethan's voice was choked with emotion. What is it? Victoria's tone was impatient. She was in no mood for his drama. I was at a brand event tonight and I heard some things about the Linwood family and the Smart City project. Get to the point. They were saying that the chief advisor for the Genesis Consortium is your old assistant, Daniel Kane. And not only that, he's Isabella Linwood's fiancé. Victoria, is this true? Did you already know? Victoria's mind went blank. A loud buzzing filled her ears. Although she had suspected it 1,000 times, the moment the truth was confirmed, the impact still hit her like a sledgehammer. Daniel was the chief advisor? The MIT PhD? The top expert? The man with veto power? It was really him? The man who had followed her for 7 years, the man she treated as an accessory, the man she thought couldn't survive without her, was actually a figure so powerful she had to look up to him? Victoria? Victoria, are you there? Ethan's anxious voice pulled her back from the shock. She snapped back to reality. Her first reaction wasn't fear, but a towering rage at being deceived and played for a fool. Ha! She let out a bone-chilling laugh into the phone. So that's how it is. She finally understood. It was all Daniel's scheme. He had hidden his identity and stayed by her side for 7 years to steal Sterling's corporate secrets, only to betray her at the most critical moment, working with his new patrons, the Linwood family, to swallow the Smart City project whole. What a cunning, manipulative man. Victoria, then what about the bid tomorrow? It proceeds as planned. Victoria's voice was hoarse with fury, but her eyes held a terrifying glint. I'd like to see just how he plans to use his position to settle a personal score in front of the entire world. She hung up, clutching the phone tightly. She wasn't backing down, she was fired up with an even more frenzied determination. She believed she had him cornered. If he dared to reject her proposal tomorrow, she would expose his identity on the spot, accuse him of abusing his power to retaliate against his former employer, and drag him and the Genesis Consortium through the mud. She stared out the window, a crazed light in her eyes. You think you've won, Daniel Kane? Tomorrow, I'll show you what it means to dig your own grave. She was completely oblivious to the judgment that awaited her. The next day, the highly anticipated final bidding event for the Smart City project began at the Ritz-Carlton's most prestigious international conference center. The hall was packed. Dozens of top media outlets from around the globe had their cameras ready. The representatives of the bidding companies sat stiffly, their faces grim. In the front row sat the true titans of the investment world. The very air in the room felt thick with tension and anticipation. Victoria and her team were seated in the center. She wore a perfectly tailored Armani suit, her hair flawlessly styled. A confident, victorious smile played on her lips, a stark contrast to her nervous competitors. Her partner, Ethan, sat beside her in formal attire, basking in the envious glances from all around. Victoria, you don't seem nervous at all, Ethan whispered. Nervous? Victoria chuckled, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Why would I be nervous about dealing with a man who clawed his way up by clinging to a woman? Her words were pointed, and several CEOs who knew her exchanged knowing smirks. The gossip about Victoria, her former assistant, and the Linwood heiress had already made the rounds in their small circle. The morning's bids were uneventful. Several companies presented their proposals, but none seemed to capture the interest of the Genesis Consortium representatives on the judging panel. Finally, it was Sterling Corporation's turn. Victoria took the stage herself. She started her presentation, her voice captivating as she laid out her perfect plan. She was undeniably a charismatic leader, transforming a dry technical proposal into a grand, inspiring vision. Applause began to ripple through the audience. Even a few of the foreign representatives on the panel looked impressed. Ethan watched the woman on stage with pride, seeing her as a queen in complete command. Her speech ended. Victoria gave a slight bow to thunderous applause. She returned to her seat, a smug look on her face. She was certain that even Daniel Kane couldn't find a single reason to reject such a flawless proposal. If he dared, it would be a clear case of personal revenge. Just then, the host stepped onto the stage, his voice solemn. Thank you, Sterling Corporation, for that wonderful presentation. We will now move to the final evaluation. He paused, raising his voice to build the climax. And now, please join me in giving the warmest of welcomes to the Chief Technical Advisor specially appointed by the Genesis Consortium's Board of Directors, Mr. Daniel Kane, who will come to the stage to deliver the final verdict. As he spoke, all the spotlights in the hall swiveled to focus on the entrance. Every head turned toward the large doors, waiting. Victoria leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, a cold smile on her lips. She waited for that man to walk into the trap she had set, and for the counterattack she was about to launch. The air in the hall seemed to freeze. Under the watchful eyes of hundreds, the heavy doors of the conference room were slowly pushed open from the outside. A tall, handsome figure emerged, backlit by the light from the hallway. Time seemed to slow down. He wore a sharp, white Tom Ford suit, his dark hair impeccably styled, revealing a strong brow and chiseled features. He wore no flashy accessories, only a discreet Patek Philippe watch, yet he radiated a brilliance that outshone any jewel. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes were like a starry night, deep, cool, and possessing an all-seeing indifference. His presence was so powerful and serene that the moment he entered, the bustling room fell silent, the very air seeming to purify. Following him were 4 distinguished European executives, each looking as if they had stepped off the cover of a financial magazine. They trailed him like a royal entourage, their respectful demeanor only accentuating his transcendent status. The entire hall was silent. Everyone was stunned into speechlessness by his overwhelming aura. And in the audience, the smile on Victoria Sterling's face froze solid. It was him, Daniel Kane. It was really him. Though she had imagined this moment 1,000 times, seeing him appear before her in this manner was a psychological and visual tsunami that instantly washed away all her pride and preparation. Her mind went blank, her heart pounding against her ribs as if trying to escape. She stared at the slowly approaching figure, her eyes a storm of shock, rage, disbelief, and a sliver of fear she refused to acknowledge. This is impossible.
Absolutely impossible.
The man who always kept his head down in her office could not be this commanding figure who silenced a room full of titans. It had to be a hallucination, but Daniel gave her no time to process. He walked past her without a single glance, as if she and her handsome partner, Ethan, were nothing more than empty space. He went straight to the center of the main stage, to the seat that symbolized ultimate authority, and sat down. The 4 experts took their places on either side of him. One of them, a distinguished white-haired gentleman, was Mr. Hans, the president of the Genesis Consortium's European division. The audience watched in awe as Mr. Hans personally took a bottle of mineral water, twisted off the cap, and respectfully placed it beside Daniel. His posture was not that of a colleague addressing an advisor, but of a courtier serving a king. This gesture made everyone in the audience who knew Mr. Hans's identity gasp. Daniel merely gave him a subtle nod before turning his attention to the proposals on the table. Throughout it all, his expression remained unchanged, as cold and unmoving as a glacier. The color had drained from Victoria's face, leaving it a blotchy, purplish red. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. Their gazes were a mixture of pity, mockery, and gossip, each one a tiny needle pricking her skin, making her squirm. All the traps she had laid for Daniel, all her trump cards had become a joke. A personal score to settle? Looking at the man on stage, flanked by a reverent entourage, she, Victoria Sterling, was nothing. What right did she have to be the target of such a man's revenge? She felt her entire worldview cracking and crumbling. Ethan was already pale with terror, clutching her arm, his voice trembling. Victoria, how can this be? Victoria didn't answer. She just stared at the figure on the stage. She wouldn't accept it. She refused to accept it. She had to see what kind of judgment this man she had never understood was about to deliver. On the stage, Daniel finally looked up. His gaze didn't linger on anyone in the audience but fell directly on the thick proposals in front of him. He reached out with long, elegant fingers and picked up the one on top, Sterling Corporation's proposal. The entire room held its breath. Victoria's heart was in her throat. She stared at Daniel's hand, full of both hope and dread. Daniel opened the proposal and read through it quickly, his eyes flying across the pages. His fingers slid over the paper, making a soft rustling sound that was amplified in the silent hall, beating against everyone's heart. He said nothing, simply picking up a red pen from the table. Then, as the entire room watched, he drew 3 small circles on the proposal Victoria considered perfect. The first circle was on the technical architecture diagram. The second was on the financial budget. The third was on the risk control model. The circles were small, but they burned like 3 bloody brands into Victoria's vision. She knew exactly what those 3 sections represented. They were the foundation, the very heart of her entire plan. After that, Daniel closed the proposal. He offered no comment, simply pushing it gently across the table toward Mr. Hans. Then he looked up, meeting Mr. Hans's eyes for the first and only time. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the microphone to every corner of the room, devoid of all emotion, as placid as a deep, frozen lake. He said logic confusion, data fraud, and risk assessment failed. The on-site interpreter immediately translated his words. Each one was like a razor-sharp dagger, stabbing into Victoria's heart. She shot up from her seat, her face drained of all color, her eyes wide with frantic disbelief.
Impossible.
You're lying. All our data was rigorously calculated. She shrieked, losing control. But Daniel still didn't look at her. His gaze didn't flicker in her direction for even a fraction of a second. He just looked at Mr. Hans and, in the same flat tone, delivered the final judgment that would nail Victoria to the pillar of shame forever. He spoke in perfect, clear English, his words echoing through the hall. It's on the same level as the first project I did for her 7 years ago. Boom! The sentence detonated like a nuclear bomb in Victoria's mind and in the minds of everyone who knew their history. If his professional critique was a rejection of her ability, this final sentence was the utter annihilation of her as a person, of all her past achievements. He was telling the world, everything you, Victoria Sterling, are proud of, your so-called business acumen, all your past successes, they were all my work. Without me, you are nothing. In 7 years, you have learned nothing. You are still the same fool I had to teach step by step. Victoria felt a coppery taste in her mouth and nearly choked. She stumbled back, swaying, almost collapsing. In the audience, Ethan was ashen-faced, while competitors and the media let out a collective, stifled gasp. Oh my God, so his former assistant did all of Sterling's work? That is the most brutal takedown I have ever seen. Brutal? This is a public execution. The stares, the whispers, washed over Victoria like a tidal wave. She felt as if she had been stripped naked and thrown before the world to be gawked at and ridiculed. All her pride, all her self-respect, was crushed into dust by the man she had once despised, in the most casual and cruel way imaginable. And on the stage, Daniel Kane, having delivered his verdict, acted as if he had just completed a minor chore. He placed the red pen back on the table, nodded at Mr. Hans as if to say, "My work here is done," and stood to leave. Daniel's verdict was like a divine decree, bringing the bidding war to a close. Mr. Hans stood up, took the microphone, and with a corporate smile, announced, on behalf of the Genesis Consortium, "I officially declare that Sterling Corporation's proposal has not passed our final evaluation. We thank them for their participation." The words were simple, but they were a death sentence, cleanly severing Sterling Corporation's last hope. "No, I don't accept this." Victoria, like a cornered animal, shoved the table in front of her and charged toward the stage. "Daniel Kane, you explain yourself. On what grounds do you say that? This is personal revenge. This is slander," she roared, her eyes bloodshot. But before she could reach the stage, 2 imposing bodyguards in black suits materialized in front of her, politely but firmly blocking her path. One of the bodyguards gave her a slight bow, his voice calm but unyielding. "Miss Sterling, please compose yourself." Only then did Victoria notice the bodyguards had stepped out from behind Isabella Linwood. She turned and saw that Isabella was now standing beside Daniel. "Does it hurt?" she asked him quietly, Daniel shook his head, then stood up with Isabella's help. He never once looked back at the hysterical woman on the floor. He had no interest in watching her downfall. She no longer deserved a place in his world. Daniel Kane, stop right there. Victoria struggled wildly against the bodyguards. You bastard. You lied to me for 7 years. What do you want? Her screams sounded pathetic and hollow in the vast hall. Daniel didn't pause. He walked side by side with Isabella, and under the gaze of everyone present, they exited through a side door. Just as he had arrived, he left silently, taking all the light in the room with him. As their figures disappeared, Victoria's struggles ceased. All the energy drained out of her, and she collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The media's camera flashes went off like a frenzy of lightning, capturing her utter humiliation. Ethan stood frozen, terrified, wanting to help her but afraid of her wrath. The CEOs who had once been her allies were now scrambling to leave, as if fleeing a plague. When you're down, everyone kicks you. In an instant, the glamorous event had become Victoria Sterling's personal execution ground. Once the first domino falls, there's no stopping the rest. The humiliating failure at the bid set off a catastrophic chain reaction. The next morning, Sterling Corporation's stock opened at its daily limit down. Obsidian Capital, the lead investor for Project Skyhawk, officially terminated their partnership and demanded massive compensation for breach of contract. Panic swept through the company. Key tech executives submitted their resignations overnight. The board of directors blew up Victoria's phone, but she had locked herself in her empty office, refusing to see or speak to anyone. She sat like a soulless statue, the image of Daniel's cold, indifferent eyes playing over and over in her mind. She had lost. She had lost completely, utterly, and without a shred of dignity. 3 days later, Victoria finally emerged from her office. She was visibly thinner, her eyes webbed with blood vessels. Her former drive was gone, replaced by a dead, ashen exhaustion. Her executive assistant, a veteran who had been with her since the beginning, knocked and gently placed a file on her desk. Ms. Sterling, this is the information you asked me to find on the Genesis Consortium's shareholder structure. The assistant said, his voice full of pity. Victoria didn't speak, just numbly picked up the file. At the very top of the long list of shareholders, a familiar name was printed in bold. GK Family Fund, Kane Family Fund, shareholding 51%. Kane? Victoria's hands began to tremble uncontrollably. She shot her head up, her voice a raw, broken whisper. Kane, which Kane family? The assistant's eyes filled with sympathy. Miss Sterling, he said softly, it's the one that built its fortune on semiconductors and artificial intelligence, the tech giant that has a near monopoly on the global high-end chip market. The current head of the family, Mr. Julian Kane, has only one son. He didn't need to say more. The file slipped from Victoria's fingers and scattered across the floor. She leaned back in her chair, stared at the ceiling, and let out a series of choked sounds that were half laugh, half sob. So that was it. She had lost from the very beginning. She had thought Daniel was a vine clinging to her for support, never realizing she was just a blade of grass living in the shadow of his light. She thought she was giving him a chance to enter her world, when in fact she wasn't even worthy of crossing his threshold. Her precious business empire was nothing but a speck of dust in the vast landscape of the Kane family's holdings. 7 years. For 7 whole years, she had treated a flawless diamond like a cheap piece of glass from the street, casually trampling on it, carelessly discarding it. How absurd. How laughable. Seeing her broken state, the assistant couldn't stop himself from delivering the final blow. Ms. Sterling, there's one more thing. I found out that 3 years ago, Mr. Kane anonymously acquired our biggest competitor at the time, Polaris Tech, and personally stopped their hostile takeover attempt on us. And 5 years ago, on the anniversary of your mother's death, when you got drunk at that bar, it was Mr. Kane who carried you home. He fought off 3 thugs who were harassing you and ended up with 7 stitches in his arm. Also, stop, Victoria interrupted, her voice pleading. She closed her eyes, and 2 streams of hot tears finally slid silently down her cheeks. All the moments she had ignored, forgotten, or taken for granted now returned as razor-sharp knives, carving up her already shattered heart. The assistant sighed softly and placed another document on the desk. "This is my resignation letter." He gave Victoria a deep bow. "Miss Sterling," he said, "Mr. Kane was never trying to get into your world. The truth is, we were never in his." He turned and left, closing the door quietly behind him. Victoria was left alone in the office with her boundless and far too late regret. The collapse of Sterling Corporation happened faster than anyone could have imagined. The failure at the bid was the spark that ignited every long-simmering conflict within the company. The stock price hit its daily limit down for 7 consecutive days, wiping out over 80% of its market value. Project Skyhawk was officially dead, and the massive penalty fees crushed the company's fragile cash flow. Banks called in their loans, suppliers cut them off, executives resigned, and employees went on strike. The once mighty business empire was on the verge of bankruptcy within 2 short weeks. Victoria Sterling, the woman who once stood at the top of the pyramid, was now a joke. She was abandoned by everyone. Even Ethan had immediately cut ties with her and disappeared. One evening at dusk, Victoria sat alone in the CEO's office that had once been the symbol of her power, but was now utterly empty. She hadn't turned on the lights, letting the fading sunlight stretch her lonely shadow across the floor. On the desk, a financial news channel was reporting on Sterling Corporation's impending bankruptcy liquidation with unconcealed glee. She listened numbly, her hand clenched around a glass half filled with amber whiskey. Suddenly, her phone screen lit up. It was a push notification from a global news app. A bold headline stabbed her in the eyes. "Marriage of the Century. Heir to tech giant Kane family weds Hong Kong's Linwood heiress. Couple announces joint $100 billion fund for top European AI lab." Below the headline was a large, crystal-clear wedding photo. The backdrop was an ancient castle in France, covered in white roses. Daniel Kane, breathtakingly handsome in a custom Vera Wang suit, was holding Isabella Linwood's hand, a soft smile on his face as he looked at the camera. Gone was the subservience of the past. Gone was the cold indifference of the bidding hall. In his eyes was a light she had never seen before, a brilliant, serene, and gentle glow, saturated with love and happiness. Victoria stared at the photo, at the man whose smile was like a spring breeze, and her breathing grew ragged. She could almost hear the sound of her own heart shattering into a million pieces. She had lost. She hadn't just lost her career, her pride, and her life. She had lost the one person in the world who had once seen only her, who had been willing to give her everything, the best man in the world, Daniel Kane. And she was the one who had pushed him away. He, a broken, ugly laugh, more painful than any sob, escaped her lips. The whiskey glass slipped from her grasp. Crash! The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed in the silent twilight, piercingly loud. Spilled liquor and shards of glass littered the floor, reflecting the last rays of the setting sun like a pool of fresh, unhealing blood.